Virbellum. The year was 1460. I was barely 100 years old, and my village was on fire. The first whiff of smoke from it brushed my nose as I crossed the border into the land of Faerie. I didn't bother thinking through why my home could be aflame, or how rushing headlong towards it could bring new dangers my way. I just dashed forward as hard as I could and for as long as it took, until I found the low hill which sheltered my clan of fellow armorers and weaponsmiths on its far side. From here, the smell of smoke was no longer a whiff, and I could practically taste charred wood on my tongue as I crested the hill. Houses, their frames lovingly crafted by hand, saw, and chisel as opposed to spellcraft, burned under the perpetually aurora borealis lit twilight of Faerie. Every few seconds brought a crack as a rafter collapsed, or a pop as a window burst from the heat of the flames. The stench of char was thick in the air, and no one, not a single soul, could be seen. My breath grew ragged, and the ash stung my throat as I cast my gaze across the village from top to bottom. Goblins were always out and about in my home. On a slow day, one would be hammering wares on an anvil, while a half-dozen more whittled statuettes from living wood that writhed in their grasp. And when dangers came, we didn't hide. We fought with wit and cunning and vicious trickery until all of our enemies were dead or gone, just as our High Lord of Lords demanded from his antlered throne. Could we have lost? Impossible. I'd only been gone from the village for a few hours. There had to be holdouts. I just had to find them. With careful footsteps, I darted from one rock, boulder, or tree's shadow to another until I found myself at the edge of my village. There was so much smoke in the air that black char was already staining my fingers, even though I hadn't laid hand on a single thing. One of the closest buildings was one I knew well. In the front was a little stand where a goblin maid should be selling crushed button mushroom bread that she baked fresh every evening. Behind it was a workshop. My workshop, to be specific. With a glance around to make sure I was unobserved, I darted into the depths of the building. Though the front was neat and tidy, with sacks of wheat and jars of honey stored in neat little rows, my space was a clamor of the martial trinket soldierly machinations and occasionally naval experimentations that often filled my free hours. One corner held a combination hatchet and longsword that I hadn't quite gotten the balance well in hand, while another harbored a clockwork monstrosity of a crossbow that I'd once built on a whim to silence inquisitive mice. None of the corners, or centers, or anywhere else's played host to one of my neighbors or friends. That didn't stop me from searching with swift, shaking hands, though. I checked under cots, inside cabinets, and even up the cooking hearth, its embers still glowing a dull, surly red, all for signs of life. Nothing. Skies above. Where was everyone? No matter, keep looking. And keep looking I did until a tightness in my mouth bared my teeth and a quiet snarl as frustration took hold of me. I wanted to kick something, to scream, to break and shatter the trinkets and tools that I'd collected in frustration, and even went so far as to grab a sack from a table and begin to toss it into the smoldering, lifeless hearth. A mixture of memory and basic caution stayed my hand before I could finish my throw. The weight of the sack in my hand wasn't that of simple grain. It was heavier, and its contents coarse enough to feel even through the rough weave of the bag. I remembered. Gonne powder. That's what the mortal trader had called it when I bartered for it on one of my more recent visits to the mortal world. Black as coal and volatile in the presence of flame, according to the merchant who sold it to me. Apparently, the mortals used it to launch rocks from tubes in an attempt to kill each other more efficiently. I thought it to be lackluster in both usefulness and power, but that didn't mean that tossing it into a hearth with still burning coals would be a wise choice in a situation like mine. A silent curse ran through my head as I lowered my hand, gripping the sack of gunpowder, and began to relax my grip.
"Who goes there?"
called a voice from outside of my workshop.
"In the name of the High Lord of Lords, announce yourself."
In the name of the High Lord of Lords? My heart leapt in my chest at those words. My people had been attacked, so of course he'd send his forces to aid our defense. Obviously the battle, though hard fought, had been won and was now over. All that remained was for me to reunite with my people and thank our saviors. I began to open my mouth to call out my name, my clan, my hard-earned title. But something stilled my tongue. Why just one voice? Why not dozens or hundreds? Any attack that could have shattered my home would need to be massive, even if only to overcome the sheer number of familiar, well, to me at least, traps that festooned our village. Maybe it had been massive, but the High Lord of Lords had shattered it despite its mass. Yes, that was the only thing that made sense. The only thing that had to make sense, because the alternative was unthinkable.
"Announce yourself!"
shouted the voice from outside my workshop again.
"Announce yourself or face destruction in the name of the High Lord of Lords."
It was that last part of the declaration that made me speak up. I have many vices to my name. Distractibility, wanderlust, a curiosity without caution. But no one, none at all, could ever claim that I was disloyal to my lord above lords. "Virbellum, I am called," I shouted in response, my voice quaking with maybe tension or relief or possibly just the cursed smoke in the air. "Virbellum of the Lean Bayless clan, trader of curiosities and crafter of trinkets. Who goes outside?"
"Skies above!"
gasped the voice from beyond my workshop walls.
"Skies above, dear Goblin! Come out and take my hand, and be done with this ruin."
For a moment, I took umbrage at his use of ruin as the name for my home. But, despite my temper, a ruin was indeed what I stood amid. My home had been devastated, and I had no idea why or by whom, so there was nothing left to do but sigh and push forward. I exited my workshop and once again entered the ruin of my village with useless pouch of gunpowder still clutched in my hand. Towering above me, which was by no means a feat due to my diminutive height, stood an elf. He was a rather young one at that, judging by the unsure droop of his shoulders and unseasoned look in his eyes. Dirt and char smudged his otherwise shining armor, and I even noted a few places where what looked like spots of acid had tainted the enchanted brass of his shield. True to his word, the elf held a gauntlet-covered hand outstretched. I didn't realize how wobbly on my feet I'd become until his strong fingers closed around my shoulder and steadied me.
"Calm, friend,"
he said, and I felt the words as well as heard them. From thundering chest in one heartbeat to cool, soothing, blissful peace in the next. Though never much of a scribe of myself, I still knew the touch of magic when it was upon me. This was a spell of peace, a spell of mercy. Skies above, thank him for it. The elf said something more to me, but it didn't really matter at the moment. I was docile as he then led me away from my workshop and deeper into the village. I passed a blacksmith's half-collapsed forge and stepped over the shattered roofing beams of a potter's storehouse, and didn't care about either as I did. The elf in shining armor said something that I didn't quite catch. "What was that?" I asked, my head fuzzy and attention already drifting.
Would you like to be with what remains of your people?
Asked the elf. Surety and purpose cut through the haze in my mind just as surely as a lightning bolt. My people, where? Yes, friend, I said, or tried to say. The haze had begun to return to my skull, though, and I had to push back hard against it to keep hold of what I'd been offered. My people were near. I had to go to them, but instead of being able to put words to my cause, I was only able to nod once and clutch the useless pouch of gunpowder even harder in hand. The village wasn't large, so there wasn't much further to go until I found myself led by the kind armored elf at the central square. Cobblestones, once bone white from polish and constant communal upkeep, were now smeared black with soot and brown with some unfamiliar grease. A pile of something large and reeking of charred meat burned in the heart of the central square, but I paid it no mind. I did notice the other elves there, though. Elves that I recognized. I saw the Lady Chow of the River Storm and Sea, her coral crown strewn hair flowing in the breeze. There was also Lord Shalene, the Whisperer, his mouth even now writhing with unheard calls to the Aurora Borealis churning above. Most of all, there was the Lord of High Lords, the Earl King. As was his custom for my lifetime, he wore a black patch over one eye. The other was spring leaf green and sharp with vigilance. Tattoos covered his bare chest, and each of them writhed in a constant, sluggish shift from script to pictographs and back again. Shining, bright strands, more white than gray, fought to break free of the braids he'd woven into the hair of his cheeks, chin, and half-shaved scalp. Growing from underneath those braids was an even brighter, almost painfully bleached white crown of antlers that rivaled his shoulders in width. The spear in his hand was bloody, not just bloody, gruesome, with meat and gore and everything in between, and as I approached, that spear lifted to point at me. "What is that?" asked the Earl King, my Lord of High Lords. Once again, I opened my mouth to speak, but the cursed fog in my head seemed to press in even harder and steal words from my tongue.
"A survivor,"
answered the elf who'd served as my guide before I could clear the clouds from my skull.
"I have brought him here to be with his people."
"Ah," replied the Earl King, with a nod of his head that made his bright hair slide across his bright antlers.
"His people, of course."
The Earl King gestured once to the center square with its unbelievably foul stones. Even through the drift of my thoughts, I managed to latch on to something there. Something about that burning pile in the midst of the square and how dirty the stones around it seemed to be. How could something, even war or strife, befoul those beautiful cobblestones so thoroughly and in so little time? So focused was I on those filthy, greasy, soot-covered cobblestones that I missed what the Earl King said next. By the time I managed to focus enough to turn towards him, he had already spun on a heel and taken a step away. He vanished before that step landed on the earth before him. Not hard to see or taking flight to the clouds, as was occasionally the case with elves. Just vanished, simply not there, as if he'd been a figment of my imagination. The other elves departed shortly after. Some did so by flight. Others, like the lady child, departed via glowing displays of power that left sunspots in my eyes. Only my armored elven guide remained with me in the square by the time my vision cleared. I looked around but saw nothing but my guide and that burning pile in the midst of the central square. "Where are my people?" I asked, my thoughts growing sharper and my will hardening into something like iron. "When can I meet them?"
"Friend, be calm, I say," he said. "Your friends, your family, are but steps away. Simply turn, and you will see them."
For the second time, I felt the press of his words in my head. But some ugly stench of meat that cut through the stink of soot around me distracted me too much for his words to take hold. "Where are my people?" I said, my voice close to a snarl. The elf sighed. He sounded, what? Disappointed? Conflicted? Whatever the emotion on his face, he answered me plainly.
"Behind you," he said, "in the fire."
A horrible recognition took hold of me, and I turned so fast to look over my shoulder that my neck almost snapped from the speed of the motion. With head clear and eyes hard, I now saw the smoldering pile in the heart of the town center square for what it really was. Blackened bones and hunks of even blacker char formed the bulk of the mound that had been shoved into a pile. Bits of clothing and metal trinkets worn like jewelry in my people's myriad day-to-days formed the rest of the burning mass. This pile was bodies. The bodies of my friends and family. Skies above, I thought. What am I going to do? What a stupid thing to ponder when there were more pressing matters at hand. The elf stabbed me in the back, just under the right shoulder, while I was busy gawking at what remained of my community. His blade was sharp and cut through me without so much as a whisper. Pain screamed through me, and in a mad attempt to get away from the blade, I stumbled forward and straight into the fire. If I thought the elf's blade stung, it was no comparison to true burning. I held out a hand as the burning pile drew near and managed to keep my head out of the flames before me. Coals built from the corpses of my friends seared into the flesh of my palm, even as some desperate voice in my head shouted at me to do one thing above all else. Keep your other hand out of the fire. Keep your other hand out of the fire. Keep your other hand out of the fire. Agony raged through my arm, giving me a chance for more thoughts to flash by. My other hand? I was stabbed, burning, and bereft of friends. Why would one hand matter more than another? How could one hand matter more than anything? And then I remembered what I still carried in that hand. And I remembered what it could do under the right circumstances. That realization was important, and I was glad I managed to reach it in time. But first things first, I was still bleeding dry and amid the burning bones of my friends. So with as massive a shove as I could manage with my one scorched hand, I pushed myself backwards and away from the funeral pyre of my village. The motion gave me enough momentum to tumble away from the flames and onto my back. Cool air replaced the inferno I just escaped, but it brought little relief. The flesh across the back of my empty hand was already blistered, and tiny embers embedded in my shirt sleeves and collar were in the process of swiftly approaching their own rebirth as flames. However, my free An injured hand, though, still gripped the gunpowder I'd retrieved from my workshop. Gunpowder that didn't mix well with flame, which meant that I still had a chance at something, if I could time it right.
Calm, friend. Be calm,
said the elf who'd guided me here, even as he took a step forward with blade he'd stabbed me with in hand. I could feel the magic of his words at play as he approached, but found them less impactful, with wounds that ranged from gaping to steaming, still sending lightning flashes of pain through my body. My hands began to shake then, but I didn't let go of the pouch in my unburned hand. The elf walked forward until he came within striking distance. Then he stopped and tilted his head to one side.
Do you know why he did it?
He asked, his eyes bearing down on me, his expression, mournful? I didn't answer him, just gritted my teeth and counted my heartbeats as the embers in my shirt sleeve grew into tiny flames.
There had been rumors, but no one knows for sure,
he continued.
Surely for something so drastic as this, you must know. For all of this to be put to the torch, you all must know, don't you?
When I didn't answer, the elf sighed again and tightened his grip on his blade. No. I had a plan. A dumb plan, but my only plan. The time for its end was drawing near, but I couldn't have this elf injure me too soon. I just needed him to hold off until my smoldering could truly take flame. It was obvious that this elf wanted an answer for whatever he was talking about. Unfortunately, I had no clue why the Earl King, the Lord of Lords, had taken flame to my people. So with no ideas of truth worth sharing, I decided on a lie. I know, I croaked.
Yes, said the elf. Tell me, please. If you tell me, I'll make it quick.
I flicked an eye over to the pouch, still in my unburned hand, and the smoldering shirt sleeve in my very much burned other hand. No flames yet, but it would have to do. I croaked something else, but this time made sure to keep my words hushed enough for even elven ears to miss.
What was that?
Asked the elf. I croaked nonsense again.
What was?
The elf said as he leaned in closer. With one jerking rush, I shoved the palm-sized sack of gunpowder into the elf's open mouth. The rough fabric blocked his airway, and he gagged for a moment. From around the new obstruction, he tried to say something else, maybe a curse, maybe a curse. Regardless of his intent, I shoved my other, still smoldering, very much burned hand into his mouth before he could speak. The smoldering fabric of my sleeve made contact with the gunpowder. The explosion was quite literally deafening. There was no sound, just pressure that smashed me flat against the ground. A high ringing drowned out all sensation of the world other than the sight of the elf, and a disturbing lack of agony, or anything else, for that matter, from the burned hand I'd used to ignite the gunpowder. I didn't want to look at the damage of that hand. Didn't want to see what, if anything, remained of it. So instead, I stared at the elf. The bottom half of his jaw was shattered in a jar. The top half of his everything else was altogether absent. He fell. I waited there for a whole minute, but what remained didn't stir, didn't stand, didn't so much as try to rise to its feet. That was more than enough caution when it came to mortals, or even goblins such as myself. But when it came to elves, one could never tell, and it paid to be safe. So once my head stopped spinning enough for me to walk without falling, I made my way to one of the least damaged households near the city center. Inside, I found 2 sets of cutlery. One was of iron, crude but durable and meant for everyday use. The other was of silver and finely wrought by our finest artisans. After all, one could never know when a High Lord might decide to pay us a call, and it was only proper for us to show them the courtesy of serving meals with utensils that wouldn't rot their flesh and set their blood aflame by mere contact. I ignored the silver, took the iron knife from the cupboard, and walked back to the center square. Just as I'd feared, the elf I'd thwarted was not. Though his head was more than half missing, his foot had begun to twitch, and blood was beginning to swirl near the stump of what remained of his head. If given enough time, this elf would probably heal back to a state of near perfect health. It was only sheer luck that he'd been hurt enough to not have been able to manage a recovery while I'd been gathering my wits. So, with a grunt that I couldn't hear for the ringing of my own ears, I dropped to my knees beside the elf with iron knife in hand. I leaned in close and placed my mouth beside the tattered shreds of the elf's remaining ear. I don't know why the Earl King did what he did, I said, but I do know this. His carved skull will be the trophy I hold high once I have my revenge. I think the elf tried to say something in response, but my knife was already driving home before he could begin. He jerked once, and ghostly blue-green flames without heat or sting flickered up from the wound I just made in his chest. Exhaustion dragged at my bones as I slumped against the elf's ruined corpse. Revenge, I thought. How silly. How impossible. The Earl King wasn't just an elf. He was the Lord of High Lords. Our monarch, our king, and the most powerful being in existence. To gain the notice of such a thing, let alone gain revenge, would take more than I'd ever done, more than I'd even heard of anything ever doing. Despite my bold words to a dying elf, it was plain that touching him would be impossible. Or at least, it should have been. Until I looked back at the funeral pyre he'd made of my people. I watched what remained for a long time, the smoke stinging my eyes until there was no smoke and no tears left to blink away. Revenge on the Earl King, his skull as my trophy. To kill the Earl King would take more power than I'd ever dreamed of, so I'd have to dream bigger. To kill the Earl King would take a goblin far smarter than me, so I'd have to become smarter. To kill the Earl King would require a vicious, blackened heart. I'd never been a wrathful goblin, but after looking at what he'd done to my people, I knew that last requirement would not be a problem. So with that in mind, and my destination clear, I wiped the soot-darkened tears from my eyes and got to work. Scav.
The frozen shadow that visited the ruined goblin village was not one to question the fairness of a fight. As mother of many things, she understood and appreciated the advantage inherent in surprise. What she didn't understand, and appreciated even less, was waste. 24 goblins, artisans all, crafters of fine spears and weavers of silk so soft that all but the most powerful spellcraft struggled to cling to their threads. 24 perfectly useful goblins, put to the axe, arrow, and torch. She shook her head. The Earl King, for all his faults, had never been wasteful. If his hand was at play here, as her minion suggested, then he must have had a reason worth more than mere pique. As was the case with all, well, most high lords and ladies of Faerie, Scath was loyal to her would-be king. But loyalty did not, by strict definition at least, require the abandonment of curiosity. And so the frozen shadow wandered the ruined village, turning the knob on a shattered door here, inhaling the stale aroma of fear in the cellar there, following the trail of slaughter until the center square, a smear where bodies had clearly been piled and burned, drag marks and shallow graves where what remained had been put to rest, blood, goblin blood that was fresh and largely unburned, staining cobblestones. Oh, and the mostly headless corpse of an elven knight, an iron knife still jutting up from his ribs. The shadow, named Scath, smiled. She may not yet know the mystery of why the Earl King had struck in so total a fashion, but she could always understand, and most importantly, appreciate it when she found a new prospect who showed promise. The end. This has been 7 Dead Elves, Part 1, Gonne Powder, narrated by the author, Robert McKinney, which is me. Hi. I really hope you liked what you heard. There may have been some rough edges and compromises to get this into your headphones, but enough folk have asked for something similar to this that I thought I'd give it a shot. Please hit the like button if you enjoyed what you heard, and maybe even hit subscribe if you want to hear more. I'll try to get the next entry of this story in your hands in not too much time, but if you can't wait that long, the books are already up for grabs on Amazon Kindle. So until next time, take care, stay safe out there, and try to find something cool to read. I just wrapped up my 1000th reread of the Dresden Files, and I'm looking forward to something new to dive into. If you have an idea for what I should try next, be sure to drop it in the comments.